Hello, folks. This is Tommy's Outdoors 46. And I must say, this is a milestone episode for me, personally. You probably heard a dozen of times that I'm a semi retired, super passionate shark angler. And ever since I started this podcast, I wanted one day to have someone from Shark Trust on the podcast. Well, that day is today. Our guest is Ali Hood, a director of conservation in Shark Trust, and we spent over an hour talking sharks. I was especially happy to be able to talk with Ali about the role of anglers in shark conservation, as well as discuss three species of shark that are particularly interesting to me: porbeagle shark, Sixgill shark, and mako shark. But there's a ton more of what we discussed, and it's all very interesting. So if you want to learn more about sharks and conservation of these important creatures, crack open a can of your favorite beverage, sit back, and listen up. All right. Ali Hood, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tommy.
Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate your time being with us here. You are a director of conservation in Shark Trust,
Yeah, that's great.
and Shark Trust is particularly close to my heart because I must say that my involvement in conservation and kind of getting involved and doing something for nature started with Shark Trust really 10 years ago. So maybe you will tell us, from directly from the director of conservation, what is Shark Trust and what Shark Trust does.
What does the Shark Trust do? My goodness, that's a very big question, actually, because for a compact team of people, we have a really significant global footprint. But the intention of the Shark Trust is to safeguard the future of sharks, skates, and rays. So when I say shark, I'm generally meaning all elasmobranch fish. um, through science, education, influence, and action. And the science is a very important thing there. All of our work is underpinned by science. That is what gives us the informed positions through which we work. We deliver on sort of three key pillars of activity. We are an organisation that strives towards sustainable fisheries where possible, but really ensuring that effective science-based catch limits are in place for all shark, skate, and ray fisheries as required. We work for wildlife protection for those species of sharks that really need that added layer, that really precautionary approach. There's a very interesting sort of tangent there that we could take later in our conversation to look at the difference between sharks that are treated as wildlife and those that are treated as perhaps a fisheries commodity. And on that line, we also work on issues of responsible consumption and trade. So our work takes us from engaging in citizen science activities here in the UK and Ireland on beaches or with the angling community, through into engaging with other organisations in citizen science activities around the world, to domestic fisheries, working on international wildlife treaties, and particularly high seas fisheries management. The high seas make up an enormous percentage of our global ocean. I did a piece of work earlier this week actually that looked at the fact that I think it's 64% of the surface of the ocean is high seas, thus beyond jurisdiction of any country, and by volume, 95%. So our work on high seas fisheries issues is particularly important.
Yeah, and it's particularly hard to enforce, I would imagine, any regulations because it's like, not, like we've seen, and surely people who are following what's his name, Animal Planet series on whale wars, I guess was like how hard it is to enforce
Mm.
anything at the high seas because it's like, it's costly to get there. There's really vast areas and a lot of illegal activities are going on the high seas.
Well, so yes, I mean, high seas waters are difficult to manage. They are a long way from shore, but there are bodies called regional fisheries management organisations, the RFMOs, who do have a remit for the management of these areas, and sharks come under their purview. So what we do as an organisation, working with our colleagues in the Shark League, is to seek binding recommendations to have legal requirements for the nations that fish in these high seas areas. And for example, in the Atlantic, we attend meetings of ICAT, that's the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, where we can work with over 50 nations in one go to see the adoption of legal requirements for management for our shark species that are caught in those waters. Now, that's no mean feat. It's consensus decision making. Everybody has to agree, but it is a route through which those high seas areas can be managed, and at times managed hopefully effectively.
Yeah. But is it sometimes happen that there's like one particular government that says like, well, no, I don't care, I'm not working with you, and they do whatever they want?
Unfortunately, yes. But one of the very positive things about being based here in Europe is, and this might sound slightly odd, Europe is one of the largest shark fishing entities in the world.
Yes,
In
thanks
fact,
for sharing that, because that's a thing,
yeah,
that's a seldom known fact, that actually
I know,
Europe catches the most sharks in the commercial
yeah.
fisheries.
And this is, people often say to us, why is the shark trust not working in the Far East? Why are you not looking at the fin trade, for example, in China? Well, simply because Europe is one of the greatest and largest suppliers of shark fin, of shark meat into these trades. And so, we need to work to get our own house in order. We do have legal frameworks through the European Commission, through the 28 member states, through which to see effective fisheries management and shark finning regulation actually enacted and enforced. And so it's really, we have an opportunity through Europe to see laws change, and they have changed over the last few decades. We've seen great improvements in shark finning regulation. We have a fins naturally attached policy, which is extremely valuable, and this is mandated by the European Commission now. They now push this message and this need out through all of these high seas fisheries bodies, where the majority of these species within the fin trade are caught. But we also then, on our doorstep, have those nations who are catching the most sharks, and particularly Spain, Portugal. Historically, France was a larger lander, the UK. And so, we have the ability to directly engage with those nations who really are catching the most sharks, and many of them with no limits, with no catch limits in place.
Especially the fins naturally attached. It's fantastic, because it's something that I feel like it happened. I kind of could see through your information campaign how Shark Trust was campaigning for that, and how this actually happened. And you mentioned that you guys are like a small group of people based in Plymouth. I think that's how you pronounce the name, right?
Plymouth, yep.
Plymouth. And but you have like a truly global reach. How did that happen? How you achieved that?
Well, not alone is the key thing there. So in all of these instances, collaboration is key. I mentioned on the high seas, we work as part of the Shark League. That's a collaboration of Shark Advocates International, the Ecology Action Centre, and Project Aware. We work as part of the Global Sharks and Rays initiative. Again, a fantastic collaboration of some really well-known organisations, including WWF, WCS, the IUCN Shark Specialist Group, Shark Advocates International, and Traffic. It's really important that we work together. But with regards to the finning regulation, in 2003, when the original European shark finning regulation was adopted, there was a very small set of organisations working on this. We then, through 2006 to 2013, became a founder member of a collaboration, a campaign known as the Shark Alliance, which brought together, over 100 organisations of varying sizes across Europe, from very passionate dive groups through to science-based organisations, large NGOs, and we all worked in a very concerted effort towards securing this best practice in shark finning regulation. That is requiring that sharks are landed with their fins still naturally attached to their bodies. And so in that case, the carcass must come ashore still with the fins. They can be partially cut and then flapped against the carcass to ease storage. But it means that for an enforcement officer, they can go on board a vessel. If a shark has no fins, then that is an infraction of the law. And it allows us to identify species far better, leading to more informed fisheries management decisions. Prior to that point, there was massive loopholes within the shark finning regulation. You could land your fins into one port, you could land your carcasses into another port, and it really relied on scrupulous skippers keeping good logbooks, and as a result left a gap for unscrupulous operations. The generous, what we call fin to carcass ratio, meant that more fins could be landed than carcasses, and you would still legally be within that limit. So best practice, landing sharks with their fins naturally attached, allows us then to move towards effective shark fisheries management, which is really essential and something that was adopted in the Mediterranean last year, which was a really fantastic success. So collaboration is always key, working together towards these shared objectives.
Is that the kind of like a main, I suppose, way of operating by Shark Trust? Because what I think personally is that Shark Trust is sort of a gold standard how NGOs should operate, um, because I feel like you're doing everything right. The amount of information of what you do is actually very good, and that information is very accessible. So as a member, I can always see what you're up to, what you're doing, what are the actions that you're taking. You collaborating with a lot of organizations. I think your social media channels are absolutely great because they're informative, they're positive. You're like I like to say, you're not spending time being angry on Twitter. The opposite. This is like a positive message every time, reinforced. And is like, how do you guys doing that? It seems like you probably would hire like an army of consultants and people to manage the PR.
I wish. No, there's I'm just doing a quick count on how many we are now. We're 8 staff.
Wow.
There's 4 in the conservation team. We how do we do this? A lot of coffee and biscuits. No, but it's an incredibly dedicated team of people, and thank you. That's a huge compliment to our whole team, everything that you've just said there. But you'll also appreciate that the creation of accessible information isn't easy. We work in a very, very complicated area of fisheries management, of multiple nations involved, of complicated policy frameworks, and to digest that and produce it in a manner that people who aren't in the sector can understand is a challenge, but something that's essential because people do get confused, and understandably very easily, the difference between shark finning and the removal of shark fins at sea and shark fin bans. And you see these errors creeping into newspaper articles, into television programs, into online content. And so it's really important that we continue to clarify those points to our supporters and to people beyond that, because otherwise a lot of these conversations happen at cross purposes, and we need everybody moving in the same direction. With regards how we deal with our social media, we feel that we do have a responsibility to ensure that people understand the facts behind a position. So if a shark is landed, it may well be landed perfectly legitimately. You as a supporter or as an individual may have an ethical or moral view of whether that was right or wrong. But people can get particularly emotional about these things. And so it's really important that we give the facts and we say, look, that shark was legitimately landed. Here are the regulations that would cover, say, if we talk about thresher sharks, you can't land big eye thresher, but you can land common thresher. The important thing is to understand what species are we looking at, what's the legality behind it, and then start a dialogue with people to help them understand perhaps why one is relevant and the other isn't.
Yes. So in general, how would you say if the status of sharks and in general elasmobranch species are like we know that in general nature is in trouble, right? Everything is in
Yeah,
decline and so on,
yeah.
decline and so on and so on. But how you would describe the current status? Is it hopeful, or is it like damage limitation and it's not gonna happen? Like how does it how what's your view on
Um, Personally, we always have to be hopeful,
that?
because working in this sector, if you can't look at things and have belief that things can change,
Mm-hmm.
then to be honest, you wouldn't come into work in the morning.
Yeah.
So it's really important to maintain an optimism and a belief that you can change things. Um, what is the status for sharks? It's really, really concerning. They are amongst the most threatened vertebrate species, full stop, not just in the oceans, but on the oceans, in the land. Over 25% of elasmobranchs are in a threat category. Um, you know, the status of many species, as we've seen from recent IUCN Red List reassessments that have been released, we're seeing some of our species decline their status on the red list, so whether they're endangered, critically endangered, or possibly, least concern. That would be a great thing. But we are seeing, and this is where we have to focus as well, we are seeing species who, through effective fisheries management, are showing some signs of recovery.
Wow.
So we have seen species whose populations have started to return. And one of the things we must be careful of working in conservation is to not only focus on the negative, on the species who are in the threat category, who are endangered, but also to make time for those species where we see and celebrate
Yes.
those species where we see populations improving. Now, I said earlier in our conversation that we as an organisation work towards sustainable fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
And if we see a population that can improve to a level at which a sustainable take is possible, then that we see that as a positive. Sharks are caught; they are caught in mixed fisheries. This is an unavoidable truth,
Yes.
and so we need to therefore see that they are managed as effectively as possible. And that takes us down a route of some people's view that all shark fishing should be prohibited. But we must understand that prohibiting something doesn't mean it's not caught, and doesn't mean there isn't mortality. And so the Shark Trust view is to work at the mortality end of that scale, working with the fishing industry to reduce the mortality in various ways so that we can see those populations have a chance to recover.
Yeah.
And again, this speaks to the issue of, are sharks wildlife or commercial commodities? And, there are a number of species in our waters here in the Northeast Atlantic which are critically endangered, and they reach that point due to unmanaged fishing activities. So we must now work to ensure the highest levels of protection and avoidance, and whether it's behaviour change to ensure if they're caught, that they're returned as effectively and safely as possible. There's many, many elements to this, and ways in which the public can be involved, ways in which the commercial fisheries are involved, and ways in which we need government legislation to give us that tool in which to ensure those species can be given the best opportunity.
What's an example of a species that's recovered or is starting to recover?
We've seen recovery of, or starting, a tentative recovery of certain skate and ray species. In the US, there's examples of a spiny dogfish population which has recovered, although there is new science suggesting that recovery may not have been quite as robust as initially thought. So that there's all sorts of often more tentative indications. But the key thing is that if you don't have catch limits for species, there is no chance for that population to either be fished at a sustainable level or recover. So this is why those species that are targeted and retained, or targeted and are unwanted bycatch, they all need management in some form.
Yeah, I think that you have to be incredibly positive person, like you mentioned, because you obviously passionate about sharks and you love sharks, and yet you working in a setting where you talking about, oh yeah, you can land sharks, but the fin attached and so on and so on. Is it
Hmm.
hard?
Um,
I
I
mean, like,
always
is
think
it part of you that would like to, say go and say like, well, leave sharks alone, don't do anything to them, let them recover.
I think one of the important things, and I might be strung up for this, is that um, I'm a marine biologist by training, and sharks are the species that I work for. Our members and our supporters, they have that sort of luxury of having that pure passion for sharks. Um, I have to take a more scientific approach to this issue. If we walked into a meeting with purely an emotive argument,
Hmm.
we would lose that position very rapidly. If we walk into a meeting with the best available science informing our positions, then we have far more chance of achieving success and getting the management or the protection that we need for that species. And so we must look at things, however, at times, yes, heartbreaking things can be.
Mm.
Um, we must stick to that scientific perspective because it's through that science that we can achieve the most effective fisheries management or wildlife protection, depending on the species we're discussing.
Hmm. And is that in like a feel of need of that kind of science-based factual approach made you start the get involved in shark trust? How did you become a member of a shark trust? It seems like a dream job.
I was previously working here in Plymouth at the Marine Biological Association of the United Kingdom, and the job opportunity came up. Um, I remember sitting in a very wet, windy car park writing my application for the post. My partner was out kite surfing. I'd have loved to have been out kite surfing, but I had this job application to write, and it was one of those things, that was back in 2002. I'm still here. I'm still being challenged on a daily basis with the work that we deliver. And the remit of the trust and the team of the Shark Trust has grown over time to be what we are today. And it's fantastic. I am so pleased that that opportunity came up and that things aligned for me to have the job that I have today.
You're doing a great job, and I think we are lucky, and sharks are lucky that that opportunity came up, and you decided, to write your application in that, in that
Well,
on that
thank you,
day.
Tommy. But it is a massively team effort. So, and
I,
as you know, and as we've already discussed, it's also very much about those organisations that we partner with.
yeah,
And we were talking about the Shark Alliance. Some of those
hmm,
organisations are very passion driven. Some of them are science based.
yeah.
Um, but we meet some phenomenal people in our travels.
But do you think, do you think that having that too passionate approach sometimes may be counterproductive, right? You actually said
I
that.
think it can be, and this is why we like to present aspects of our work. For example, the need for catch limits for blue shark and shortfin mako on the high seas.
Mm,
This is our No Limits campaign. We like to present opportunities where the public can be engaged, where we can give people direction for that incredible energy that they have for sharks and for their conservation. That we can then demonstrate to politicians, whether that's at a domestic level, whether that's at a member state level or beyond that
mhm,
in these high seas treaties, um, that, that the public are interested, the public are concerned. And alongside that, the scientific argument is this. So we can work to harness that public passion to engage political audiences
mhm.
who may not otherwise have sort of um, they like to know that their constituents see them doing
Yeah,
something
yeah.
positive. And that passion for sharks is enormous. And it's really helped open doors and reinforce that scientific message that we're delivering through our meetings with decision makers.
Yeah.
In a rounded campaign, there is always needs to be room for public engagement.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing, I want to switch gear here a little bit, because one of the things that in particular is, I think, relevant for our listeners here is that Shark Trust openly says about recognizing the role of anglers,
Hmm.
people who are interacting, for the want of a better word, with sharks for their leisure. Even though we know good and well that interaction, sometimes ends up not well for a shark.
Hmm.
Yet you recognize the importance of anglers, and you recognize anglers as a stakeholders in sharks. Let's say in sharks, right? In having sharks, which is quite refreshing, and it's very encouraging. Would you like to kind of lay it out for us? How shark trusts see the role of anglers in overall shark management and engagement in shark conservation.
Well, I mean, the trust has always been engaged with the angling community since our foundation back in the late 1990s. We're based, as you mentioned, down in Plymouth in the West Country in the UK, and we're very close to the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain, which is based in Cornwall in Looe. And one of the things that we talk about is how the anglers in Looe who had um, a real, reputation as the place to go shark fishing. The pubs are full of photographs of the sharks hauled up on the quay, for
Those
those
big 200
photo
pounds
photos.
porbeagles hanging in the
Yeah,
dock.
yeah. But in the mid 70s, they noticed over sort of a 1-2 year period a significant decline in the number of sharks that they were catching,
Mm.
particularly the number of blue sharks. We're talking almost a 50% decline. And
Mm-hmm.
over that period, they took that decision to change their practices, to stop catch and kill and to start really focusing on catch and release. And it was the anglers who noticed the change in the population levels before anyone else, because particularly at that time, sharks were not being recorded within fisheries. They weren't a species that was under any management protocol. There was no requirement to record them. And even up until the mid 2000s, you didn't have to land many species, including all the skates and rays, by species. You could land them as skate and ray. So, with the data that was coming in through the fisheries sort of route, we were not picking up on the changes in species assemblage and in the change of catch composition. Whereas anglers were seeing, they're fishing year in, year out on the same headland, seeing changes in population structure, in species diversity. And to harness that knowledge is incredibly valuable. But we also recognize that the angling community is also incredibly diverse. Some people are members of clubs, some people engage in competitions, some people are out there on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a huge diversity of attitudes as well towards what's being caught.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we've always stated that we believe that many people in the angling community practice responsible fishing. We do still have concern for the actions and practices of what I believe and hope to be a minority group, and that's
Mm-hmm.
particularly when it comes to the handling and targeting of large threatened species.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the positives, we've created a large number of materials over the years, tailored identification guides, recording platforms. We have an app where you can record your catch. We've just partnered with a body called Sea Changers and the Shark Angling Club of Great Britain to put out a best practice poster that's gone to clubs and vessels, charter vessels, to tackle shops, to really encourage the appropriate handling of the species, the reporting, not inboarding, all of these key messages that together, working with the angling community, we can work to reinforce the best practice there.
Yes. And tell me, what's the importance of the shark tagging programs? Because I know in general there are tagging programs that are mainly all those tags are put in the fish by anglers, but then they retrieved by commercial fishermen, right? So this is like all the fish that are tagged and released. Then we even know about them when they end up dead somewhere on the. Tell me what's your view on these programs? Are they important, or is it just kind of like, oh yeah, we're tagging sharks, it's great?
I think what's important is that if there is a tagging program, that tagging program is seeking to answer and realistically answer a specific question. That the tagging itself isn't being used to justify the fishing. So it's important that the anglers are involved in a tagging program that has something to answer, that it's not just a case that, hey, we tagged a shark, therefore we're feeling good, when actually that tag that is an invasive procedure to an animal, it has no ongoing purpose in providing more information or answering a specific question. And obviously the training that goes with being handed a tagging kit is incredibly important, because I'm sure the anglers would be keen to know that they're not doing any any damage to an animal that was going to cause harm or perhaps even cause its demise. So the Shark Trust doesn't personally manage any tagging programs. There's various shark angling groups, including now a project that's managed, it's been taken over and managed by the Scottish Shark Angling Conservation Network, and they have various programs running that I'm sure your listeners could look up. And so I think the key thing is to make sure that the tags are, if you are involved in a tagging program, that it's contributing to a program that has genuine intent.
Actual scientific purpose rather than just stick a
so
piece of plastic into the shark.
That it's helping us learn about the movement or the behavior of that species that can then feed into a process by which we're improving its management or its conservation, rather than for the sake of it. I think the fact that some of these tags are retrieved by the commercial industry definitely adds an element to that. Many of the species that are being tagged are highly migratory species, and to learn more about their movements is great. It's really important. But alongside the angling activity, there is a great deal of scientific tagging that goes on, putting archival tags onto species, learning a great deal about how they move through the water column on a daily basis, how they move across the ocean over weeks and months. And this can contribute to the understanding of how fishing practices could perhaps be modified in order to help avoid the vulnerable species, or avoid overfishing other species.
Sure. I have a side question before we go further. The side question is like, what's the difference between rays and skates?
This is a great question, because it's a nomenclature issue that we have here particularly in the Northeast Atlantic. So there is a specific difference between a skate and a ray, but in our waters here, we call a lot of skates, we call them rays. So things like Raya undulata, an undulate ray, that is not a ray, that is a skate. So any of the ratted species are all skates. So one of the key things is that skates lay eggs, which are phenomenally cool things, and rays give birth to live young. They also, the skates have what's known as a bifurcated pelvic fin. I love that word. You don't get to use it enough. So they have a double-lobed pelvic fin close to the tail at the back of the disc, whereas rays don't. Skates have fins along their tail, and the rays don't. So there is a distinct difference, but we have a huge confusion in terms of nomenclature in this region, and it's something that we have not tried to specifically iron out, because when we started working with the skate and ray commercial industry particularly, to talk about the large skates, so the common skates, that's now two species, the white skate, the long-nosed skate, and the Norwegian skate, the black skate, it was easier for the industry to talk about voluntary avoidance of those large-bodied species, they are much larger, and look then at appropriate retention of some of the smaller ray species. So it wasn't it wasn't the right thing to do to try and change the way we talk about
Yes.
the common names.
It would
But
introduce
then
more confusion.
more confusion, yes. We had enough confusion because the different common names for a single species from from further north in the northeast Atlantic to down here in the southwest of the UK or on the
Yes.
south coast of Ireland is crazy. The number of common names is phenomenal. So one of the first things we had to do was to come up with a dictionary of names so we all
Yes.
knew what species we were talking about. If everyone would talk in scientific names, that would be marvelous, but that's just not the
Yeah,
way it's
that's
going
a sure way of making sure that you know what species you're talking about. Use a Latin name, because
Yes,
then you have a nurse hound, and you have different now. You have a big
yeah,
dogfish. You have this that. It's like, okay, what is that? Like another example is I think monkfish. There's like
yeah.
we can rattle like 3 or 4 species straight away who are called monkfish, and yet they're completely different. There's some of they're not even the same family, but
And one of those would also be the angel shark.
yes,
So the
exactly.
angel shark, originally called monkfish, and the Shark Trust works with our colleagues through the Angel Shark Project on a number of angel shark activities in the Northeast Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. And one of the issues, particularly here in our waters, is the confusion in naming. So as angel shark monkfish populations declined, they started landing Lophius as monkfish as a replacement. They used to be, what we know as monkfish today, that high value bony fish,
Hmm.
used to be a trash fish.
Yeah.
So that also masked the change in abundance of angel shark
Yeah.
um, with the use of monkfish as we know it today on the market. So nomenclature has a big part to play. And you mentioned the dogfish.
Yeah.
Again, that is something that we have tried to get people to consider the correct names for, because the cat sharks. So you mentioned nurse hounds, bullhuss, and small spotted cat sharks. They are cat sharks. They lay eggs. They have a far faster life history strategy than the dogfish,
Hmm.
which are often deeper water species. They mature very late, even for elasmobranchs, produce very low
So now
numbers of
you're talking
pups.
about fish called spur dog. That's probably another common
Yes,
name,
spur dog
spur
and
dog,
many other
or
of the qualities.
spiny dogfish. They're
Fine
different than
dogfish,
the
yeah.
cat sharks. Yes.
Yes, they are, yeah. And so they need a very different management
Hmm.
protocol. So
Sure.
it's really important that we do make sure we all know what we're talking about, that we're talking
Yes.
about
Yes.
different or the same
That's
species.
probably one of the first things like a shark angler noticed, that there's a lot of confusion, especially in the names of the smaller sharks.
Mm,
And
mm.
listen, speaking about angling, could you give us um, some guidance or like a best practices in handling sharks? Once you have your shark on your hook, you brought the shark either to the close proximity when you're from the shore, or when you're on the boat. What are the must do and don't do things when it comes to shark handling?
I think one of the key things, if we are talking about sharks specifically here, is to remember that they have no protective rib cage. They're cartilaginous species, so they really rely on the support of water, um, to protect their internal organs. So we really discourage the inboarding of sharks unless absolutely necessary. Um, we also really encourage supporting the shark under the stomach. Um, Avoid putting it sounds quite obvious, but the number of photos you see of people with their hands in the gills, or with
Oh,
the shark really
really?
drooping.
Oh
Um,
God.
so, you need to support them securely. They are live, they are feisty, they're probably a little frustrated. And so, for your safety and for the shark's welfare, if they can be maintained in the water, if that hook can be removed, if you're using circle hooks, preferably, if you're using barbless hooks, that whole process will be eased. With regards the rays and the skates, please do not pick them up by their tail. They need to be held securely in the mid body and at the base of the tail, not by the end of the tail. So
Okay.
you're not hurling them overboard. You're not lifting them upside down by the tail alone. And again, avoid using the spiracles, which appear to be those handy kind of holes behind the eyes.
Huh.
Avoid at all costs putting your fingers into those to lift them out. So the positives there are, please attempt to not inboard the animal. If there is an unavoidable situation, then ensure that it's supported well under the stomach, and you're securely holding that tail. And if we're talking about skates and rays, hold the animal mid-body by the base of the tail, to ensure safe
Okay.
release, and then lowering into the water.
Okay. So all those pictures when you see rays being held by the fins or by the flaps, kind of tail down, that's not good ray handling.
Well, tail down is good, but
Okay.
lifting them by the tail up, so their head
Okay.
down, is bad.
Okay. Okay. So these are
It's
so
just if they're holding them, Tommy, tail down, just make sure those fingers haven't slipped into the spiracles just for extra grip, or the gills on the underside. So
yeah,
the rays have
yeah.
their gills on the underside.
Yeah, yeah. I can see that as a that recommend, like, obviously most people who are angling for sharks, they want a picture, right? They want this trophy photo. So
Mm.
recommendation of not taking them out of the water obviously is like, oh, how do I get, like, whatever. But I guess this is all comes down to, like, are you are you in for actually having those fish around? And maybe
Hmm.
that's a good segue to see, like, what is the in your view, what is the impact of recreational anglers, because this is very very often argument raised very often, like, oh, leave alone anglers and think about fisheries and all those commercial fishing, and this is what's causing a damage, and anglers are actually not have any impact on species at all. What's your view on that? Is that a true statement, or not?
Hmm. I think that any angler who is honest, who goes out fishing, who catches any species, shark or otherwise, on the end of the hook and then brings them into shore, if they are honest, will understand that that has an impact on that animal. It is not a natural part of that animal's activity. But whether there is more gained and more learned, um, and through best practice and good handling, that we can minimize the impact on those caught species is a different matter. So
Mhm.
I think that it again depends on the species that we're talking about. And one of the things that we regularly discuss with anglers is that there are restrictions on the commercial industry. So if we talk about porbeagle,
Mhm.
that's quite an emotive species. It's a phenomenal species that we have here in our waters. Can grow to over 3 meters in length. It is critically endangered. It has been subject to target fishing in previous decades. It was a very high value meat,
Mhm.
but it's a species that doesn't mature until it's in its early teens. It has a small litter of pups after sort of a gestation of around 8 to 9 months. And new evidence suggests possibly it then needs a year's rest period before it can then breed
Breed again.
again.
Oh.
Now, this species, it's the EU fleet is banned from targeting and retention of this species
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
in globally in international waters, so in EU waters and international
Hmm.
waters. It is a species that's listed on a large number of wildlife treaties.
Hmm.
In Scotland, you can't retain it as an angler,
Hmm.
but in Ireland, in England, Wales, as an angler, you can still target the species and you could retain it. Now, we would hope that responsible fishermen, responsible anglers, um, would seek to minimize any impact on a species that is critically endangered and
Hmm.
has this very vulnerable life history strategy. But we are seeing an increasing or an apparent increase in the number of charter vessels who are advertising sport fishing for porbeagle.
Yeah.
Um,
And
we
you
have
mentioned
sent.
that it depends on the species. And so we might talk about specifically some species of shark, and porbeagle is a great place to start, because obviously it's a very valuable sport fish, let's say, because of its size, because of its all the physical properties.
Hmm.
At the same time, it's critically endangered. There are two populations, I think. Is it like a East and West Atlantic population? Is that how it's divided?
Um, I believe so, but I'd need to check on that one. I couldn't say that specifically, but they are, there is a population that is that has been historically fished off the coast of Canada, in
Yes.
the West Atlantic. There is a population here in the Northeast,
So
and
they're different species, right, or different
they're not different
subspecies?
species. No, no, no. They're all porbeagle. In the Pacific, there are salmon sharks, which are very, very closely related, but it's sort of the
Okay.
Pacific equivalent to the
I always thought
porbeagle.
that the salmon shark is a common name of porbeagle, even here
No,
in
no,
the
it's
British
actually a
Isles.
different. It is actually a different species, and in
Talking
the
about
north of the
confusion with
Pacific,
naming, right?
yeah, yeah, and to be honest, species are changing regularly. The what science can show now is incredible. We see species split, we see species amalgamated, where synonyms are, and particularly for species where the numbers are particularly low,
Mhm.
and people aren't encountering them very often. And then when they compare notes over different apparent populations, different apparent species, we're finding that actually they're one and the same.
Yeah,
It's just a disjointed
sure. So just to go
population.
back to porbeagles for a second. So,
Yeah.
um, would you say so? This is as an angler and as a passionate shark angler for many years. I feel like it's difficult to not target a porbeagle and target blue shark, or like it's actually the fishing is not changing at all, right? So even if you're out there fishing for blue sharks, which
Hmm.
probably are most abundant species of a large shark in British waters, in or yeah, northeast Atlantic waters around Ireland and Great Britain,
Hmm.
um, you you will catch porbeagle sharks if they're around. And
Mm.
I think there is a lot of discussion right now because those there was very hard to get porbeagle shark. It was like next to impossible. And now we're seeing more and more anglers catching porbeagle sharks. And obviously there's this big discussion that the species recovering. Great, we have many porbeagle sharks. Versus like,
Hmm.
well, it's just the population displacement and those very few who were somewhere now they're moving either because of the climate change or whatever else. And now it actually doesn't mean that the fish is in any better state than it used to be. It's just more even more vulnerable now, and that's why it's being caught more. So
Hmm.
what's I'm wondering your comments on that, and especially on the fact that we see more landings or more catch of porbeagle sharks, and also how can you be selective about not catching or catching them outside perhaps no I'm not gonna say anything. I'm just gonna leave it to you two.
Mm. Right. Well, I think just as a commercial fisherman knows the best fishing grounds for a certain species,
Mm,
I think many anglers, and particularly the charter angler vessels, know the best grounds for fishing for a certain species.
mm,
And there are various locations here in the southwest, whether that's in England here, Wales, or the southwest of Ireland, where the charter skippers know at certain times of year they are more likely to encounter porbeagle. So
mm,
one of the key avoidances there is to avoid those areas.
mm,
Um, I myself, and I put my hand up here, Tommy, I'm not an angler.
mm,
So this is not something that I am able to discuss in terms of, well, you should use a different bait, you should fish at a different depth. That's not something that I have experience to comment on. But we do know that it is possible to avoid those areas of known aggregation. If you then happen to encounter a species where you've in waters where you've attempted to avoid them, then that's a very different scenario.
mhm,
And there's also the difference between sport and catching a fish. So if you're going to play a fish for several hours, or if you're going to bring it alongside with the least possible um, struggle,
mhm,
then there are different scenarios at play there. And also if you're going to use
mhm.
different weight lines, if you're going to use different hooks. And again, I don't
Yes.
want to go into detail here because this is something you know far more about than I do. But there are ways to minimize your encounters with species.
Yes.
And one of those is to not actively target them. So
Mm.
what we've been seeing in recent years is an apparent increase in the advertising of active targeting of porbeagle shark.
But is it not like
So
it's driven because they actually start showing up more often, and there can be some merit behind that advertisement?
is it driven by that, or is it driven by the fact that vessels can make significant money from taking people out sport fishing?
Mm.
They found a market.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
so
okay.
I,
Okay.
I don't think that we have the answer to that yet. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason I keep saying apparent is that
Mm-hmm.
also with the increased use of social media,
Yes.
it is increasingly easy to see advertising, to see the results of people out fishing. So people
Mm-hmm.
are posting their videos, people are posting their photographs.
Yeah.
So we can see an increase in the social media exposure of people fishing for porbeagle. Now, this should almost be a non-discussion. The commercial industry are prohibited from targeting and retaining porbeagle. It is a critically endangered species.
Yeah.
When the time of year that we see large porbeagle in our waters is at the time of year that the females who, given the life history strategy we discussed, are likely to be pregnant,
Yes.
then responsible anglers, I would hope, would go target something else. They
Mm-hmm.
would say, right, these are the months when actually, if we want to see porbeagle back in our waters in numbers where it's legitimate to go and target them,
Mm-hmm.
then we need to leave them for however long to see that population effectively recover.
Yes.
To suggest that the populations now of, and I don't mean to labour this point, of a critically endangered species
Mm-hmm.
are recovered is very concerning and
Mm-hmm.
misleading.
Yeah.
So at the moment, we've spent a number of years as a Shark Trust encouraging voluntary avoidance of porbeagle through the months of April through to the summer, to give these large females the opportunity to safely pup.
Yeah.
When we see an increase in engagement of likely a very small number of the whole angling community, yet a
Mm-hmm.
large number of charter vessels,
Yeah.
we have to seek to get stronger
Yeah.
protection for the
Yeah.
species.
Yeah. I think that's quite clear message for avoiding porbeagle sharks, and because they're critically endangered. I think like I have a two comments to that. So first, you mentioned like a line and how long you're going to play the fish and so on. And so
Mm-hmm.
for our listeners, really, the message is like use proper uh, line weight, use proper rod, so
Mm-hmm.
you can land the fish or play the fish as quickly as possible. And I'm guilty myself, going totally undergun for big species of shark. It's no fun because even the likelihood of losing the fish, if you playing it for a prolonged time, is higher. And I
Mm-hmm.
think among anglers, this is quite known, even in a freshwater anglers for fishing for pike, for northern pike. They'll say, "Oh, you're using 30-pound line for pike. It's like overkill." Like, well, yes, but you can, especially when you're fishing in the summer months where the water is hot, the fish doesn't really handle that well the high temperature. Do it quickly. At least do not prolong, well, the agony, because let's call it spade a spade, right? The fish on the end of the hook being kind of, it's in the agony, especially when you take it out of the water. So I think it's a kind of common sense for, like you mentioned, anglers who know what they're doing, and they're there for, they want to enjoy the species, and have a welfare of the species in mind. um, and as for the poor beagle sharks, I think that, like I said, the message is quite clear: don't land them. And it's interesting. Oh, I know. What was my second thought was, you mentioned like, if we want to ensure that the population recover, and then we can have legitimate, you know, poor beagle angling fishery, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you think, this is my thinking, like, with the absence of the organization who ensures that, that's a little bit hard sell, because And I'm always coming back to the conservation regulations that are in the United States, which in my view are the best in the world. And you
Hmm.
can comment in a second whether you think so or not. But I think that whether it comes to the land animals, deer, elk, and bear, or whether it comes to fishery, uh, America, United States are ahead of everybody else. But there are those organizations who are actually issuing a number of tags. They're scientifically
Hmm.
backed, and so on and so forth. With these organizations at play, I think it's much easier sell for anglers to say like, well, there's a ban on targeting, let's say for argument's sake, porbeagle sharks, right? You can't land them, you can't boat them, you can't fish certain areas. But if we meet those recovery measures, whatever they
Yep.
are, we can open that fishery. And then at least that's a easier sell because there's some organization that oversees that. With the
Yeah.
lack of organization that oversees that, then the question is like, well, who is to decide whether that fishery can be open or not, and who is monitoring that,
Yes.
and that's much harder sell.
No, I agree with you completely on all of the points that you've just raised there, Tommy. So, and thank you for sort of picking up on the aspects of angling that I'm not in a position to discuss. So that's fantastic. But I agree with you that you need to have the responsible body who are in a position to say, this is the current circumstance for this species, these are the management measures required to enable recovery, and to then implement those and enforce those. And almost more importantly, ensure that people know about them.
Mm-hmm.
So often, and this is a problem globally, you can have the best regulation, but if it sits on a piece of paper and isn't the community it's aimed at aren't educated to its existence or to the requirement or to why it's necessary, you're not going to get effective compliance with that regulation. So, a great deal of the work that we do at the Shark Trust is about informing people of the regulations that exist. We produce fisheries advisory materials, we produce angler advisory materials, we work with stakeholder groups, governments, really often introducing them to regulations and to the species covered by those regulations, so that they're in an informed position to educate their industries. And this, it sounds very simple, but often these basic steps are what are required, so that people are fully aware and also then have no excuse if those species are landed. So if you have been informed, if you have got resources, if you have been educated, and yet you still do something, then that's not through lack of knowledge, that's through intent.
Mm-hmm.
So that goes for many species. But the Shark Trust will continue to seek stronger protection for porbeagle shark in their
Mm-hmm.
critically endangered state. Um, we will continue to ask the anglers, um, currently, because there is no legal framework for this, but voluntarily avoid porbeagle through those months from sort of March, April through into the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And, we feel that that would be a hugely constructive step. And we are talking with representatives of the angling community, of various angling bodies,
Mm-hmm.
at least here in the UK, about this. And I think that is incredibly constructive, that we all sit down and discuss a way to take this forward
Yes.
effectively.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that what you said is it's a good time to bring the quote. I think it's from Aldo Leopold that ethical thing to do is to not do the not think that is not right, even if it's legal. So I think
Yeah,
this is perfectly can be
yeah,
applied to porbeagle sharks. Like the right thing to do, like being ethical is to do the right thing, and right thing is to not to take porbeagle, even if it's legal, because of the status of the species.
yeah,
Listen, Ali,
yeah.
there's one more. There's a much more species of shark I would like to discuss with you, but I don't know how you're for time. But there's one species and that I particularly would like to touch on, and this is Sixgill shark.
Oh,
And we see. there is a fishery for six-gill sharks, and there's a quite mixed feelings about whether these sharks should be targeted, whether they shouldn't be targeted. Other, what's their status? They're near threatened. They're data deficient. What's your view on that and on the whole deal of angling for six-gill sharks?
Wow. Well, angling for six-gill sharks is slightly different from commercial fisheries for six-gill sharks. I mean, commercially, anything that's a deep water species has a very restrictive life history strategy. So I think we need to look at this with concern. And I would believe, and I'm just looking at our Fisheries Advisories, all these materials are obviously available on our website. We have advisory cards for the deep water sharks, and there are a number of species that are listed on this. And I'm just flicking through these cards, looking for the one on deep water sharks. And there are two different regulations. So all of the central forests are covered. The blunt nose sixgill. So it's prohibited commercially to fish for blunt nose sixgill around the whole coast of Ireland from the English Channel west, and that's a really important piece of regulation to protect these, as I've said, slow growing, slow life history strategy species. If we go back to our example of the porbeagle, if there's a reason why commercial industry have been prohibited from targeting these species. I know the anglers have a reduced impact on this population than commercial fishing would, but I think the question has to be asked as to the relevance of bringing a deep water shark up to the surface, and what that benefits.
Yeah. You see, and this is quite interesting thing, and I just love to discussing this because the six-gill fishery that I'm aware of, they're actually not in the deep water. They're quite shallow water, close to the shore. So, and obviously that's not the shark that you're gonna boat because it's size of the boat. So
Yeah.
and I had that conversation not long ago whether whether there should be banned, we shouldn't target them, we should target them, and like as usual, there's a contradicting information, and I can on one hand it's prohibited from commercial exploitation. On the other hand, you have this shark who is like on quite shallow water. You're not gonna boat it, so you would think that the impact on that shark is quite low, and its conservation status is near threatened, which is, well, maybe that's you're gonna tell whether near threatened is actually means good in the air quotes or means no, leave it alone. So that's what I'm kind of inquiring, because that's a lot of information, kind of a lot of confusion of like what particular pieces of information really means for the status of the shark.
Well, I mean, one of the key things that we do have to do, and I think everybody is guilty in some way of doing this, is coupling the IUCN Red List status to expected management. So the Red List status is an expression of the population status based on the best available scientific information and informed opinion. And a lot of these statuses are changing at the moment. The global listings are changing. There was a set of species released in March, there'll be another set in July. And as we learn more and more about these species, it's possible to create and publish better informed information on them, and to ensure that their status is appropriately reflected. If a species is critically endangered, there is a reason that it has been given, or if it's endangered or near threatened, vulnerable, whatever, there's a reason it's been given that status. And that information should then help inform appropriate management. What there isn't automatic, and I believe you don't think this, Tommy, but it's a misunderstanding with many other people, that if you are a threatened species, if you are vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered, that there is an automatic management trigger as such.
Mhm.
So we also need to look at the fact that if the global status of a population is here we have something that's near threatened, it might be that local population has a different status.
Mhm.
So it's about taking each population in its own right and considering the responsible action of what you're involved in. Now, I can't say that I know enough about that particular Sixgill fishery, the angling activity that's going on there. I'm intrigued and I'd like to know more about it.
Mhm.
But beyond that, I can't pass opinion on whether it's appropriate or not. It is legal, and then it comes down, as we've discussed, to the anglers and that great quote you just had, to decide if it is the right thing to be doing.
Yeah. So for our listeners interested, it was episode 41 when my guest on the podcast was one of the skippers who are actually even goes by a nickname, Mr. Sixgill.
Wow.
So yeah, so that's where that conversation came from.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll be sending Mr. Sixgill some of our best practice and handling guides, and hoping that he is already exhibiting best practice to all of his
no. This is actually a man I know well, and I spent countless hours shark fishing with him, and those fish are never boated.
And Tommy, one of the things we'd encourage all of your listeners, and particularly the anglers out there, is to record your catch, not just in your own logbooks or with your own angling club if you're a member of one, but really to let us know the diversity of species out there. It's fascinating. The anglers, the divers, those people who are actually on or in the water are having those encounters with sharks that we don't have. We're working here in policy, or we may be working on a fish market, but those live encounters with these species and the passion that these people have for these species is phenomenal. And it really, the knowledge of what's being caught, when and where, really feeds into an improved understanding of the species. So, these records are really important. We never expect anglers to divulge their marks. We work in larger sea areas so that we can have an understanding of species distribution, but not expose any marks, either to other anglers or even, there's concerns that they would be
I wouldn't be concerned to expose the marks to scientists. Like maybe for other anglers, yes, but I think so. There is a way. So anglers can record their catch on Shark Trust website.
Or using our app, yeah.
Or using your app, and that's it. Okay, Ali, listen, that's been very informative and really fascinating discussion. Tell me, have we touched on everything that you were hoping that we're going to touch, or did I miss anything? Did I leave anything out? And if I did, please feel free to now talk about what I missed.
I think one of the things that I'd just like to bring up, and we've mentioned it in passing, but while some of the family are out angling, and the rest of the family still want to be outdoors doing things, then obviously involving yourselves wherever you are in the world, in fact, in the great egg case hunt is a fantastic thing to do. So searching the strand line on a beach for the egg cases of skates and rays, of oviparous sharks, and by finding those egg cases and recording your finds, and there's all sorts of identification materials online. There's links to our sister projects in different countries. So, for example, in Ireland, where there's Purse Search Ireland through Marine Dimensions, they take recordings. In Portugal, we're engaged with NGOs there. In France, we have colleagues who are recording egg cases, and beyond Europe as well. We're keen to see egg cases from anywhere you happen to encounter them. It's a fantastic, exciting citizen science project that is really showing and teaching us a great deal about the distribution of these species. It highlights helps pinpoint information on the only static life history phase of skates, rays, and egg-laying sharks, which can feed into management processes like protected areas. And it's fascinating. It allows at any time of the year anyone who is able to walk down a strand line on a beach to engage in shark conservation. You don't have to be a diver. You don't have to go out to sea or stand on a promontory and fish for sharks and rays. You can walk on that strand line and find this kind of treasure in the form of shark and ray egg cases. And there's an app to record that one.
Yeah, and like we said, it's a fantastic, and you mentioned that even for the whole family, even take kids and just go and like educational aspect of it. Like, what are those things that are lying on the strand? Like, what are they? I think one of the episodes of the podcast, I had like a marine scientist, and she was she said that some people were asking like, why you have bats in no, they're not bats, they're actually eggs, and it's fantastic activity, and we can learn a lot, and the kids can learn a lot about nature that surrounds us, and that's a fantastic thing, because once you learn about something, you might get excited about it, and when you're excited about something, then you want to protect it, and I guess this
exactly.
is
And it's that way to connect the public here in the Northeast Atlantic with something that's all too often portrayed in warm, blue, sunnier waters. We have a phenomenal diversity of sharks, skates, and rays in our waters here in the Northeast Atlantic, over 80 species. A number of those lay eggs that wash up on the beach. And on the Irish coastline, you have a chance to find some of the rarer species as well, the white skate, flapper skate, blue skate. That it's a very addictive pastime, not just for young people. And egg cases have no secondary use on the strand line, so we can feel fine about collecting them. And they're just phenomenally fabulous things. So we encourage everybody just to get involved in shark conservation in any way, to use our website resources, to contact us if you have any.
What's the website?
Questions.
What's the website address?
Sharktrust.org. And for egg cases, you can go straight to eggcase.org, or give us a shout on social media and we'll help you out.
That's perfect. Ali, I have one more question that I would love to ask you.
Go for it.
What's the status, or maybe what are the hopes about mako sharks in British waters? Because as far as I'm concerned, the last one was caught in the 70s, I think in 72.
Oh,
okay. But there used to be like a great fishery, especially sport fishery for anglers, were catching mako sharks. And I was actually reading that book. This is how it all started, my membership with Shark Trust. I read the book of Richard Paris, which I think was one of the founders of Shark Trust, Sharks in British Seas. And then I read there like fantastic stories about great shark angling competitions where people were angling for mako sharks, and blue sharks were actually considered a pest or something, like another blue shark, I don't want that, because they were all for mako sharks. But obviously all those mako sharks were ending up hung by their tail in the dock, and so in 70s they're gone. Is there any chance that within next, I don't know, 10, 20, 50, 100 years, we'll have mako sharks back around?
Wow. Tommy, you've touched on one of the species that takes up a lot of my work at the moment, and a lot of the work of the Shark Trust No Limits campaign. Shortfin mako specifically. There's two species, longfin, far rarer, far less encountered than the shortfin mako. Shortfin mako are still a highly prized commercial fish. They have a high market value. They're caught for their meat. And again, people often overlook the fact that sharks are caught for their meat as a significant driver of shark fisheries, commercial shark fisheries. And their fins are also valued in trade. Now, shortfin mako in the North Atlantic, their populations have declined dramatically. These are exceptionally vulnerable species. Their status has been uplisted to endangered this last year. And for many years, there has been calls for management of the species in the Atlantic, that the level of overfishing is just way too high, causing this significant population decline. And again, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, European fleets have a great deal to play in this process. They're catching the vast majority of short-fin mako. So the Shark Trust, working with our Shark League colleagues, have been pushing for a number of years now to secure effective binding recommendations on the commercial fisheries in the North Atlantic. And in 2017, we were part of an effort that secured a binding recommendation requiring vessels in the North Atlantic to release any mako that came to the vessel side alive. Mm-hmm. So this was the start of a process of reducing overfishing. The population was identified at a stock assessment as overfished, with overfishing continuing, which is not a good thing. That if a prohibition was put on that fishery from that date in late 2017, that by 2040 there would only be a 54% chance that population had recovered. Oh. The key thing there being that a prohibition alone, again something we've touched on, is not enough. You need to avoid that species. You need to have behaviour change that ensures that any animal that's put back is put back with the greatest chance of survival. We know that they have around a 70% chance of survival on release, which is good, but we need that to be even better. And the Trust and our colleagues continue to engage in the meetings that happen between the big annual meetings of these fisheries bodies, and we continue to encourage scientific engagement to ensure that the advice that comes out of these meetings is as tight and as clear as possible, so that when we then face in this case 53 fishing parties that are involved in the Atlantic, that the case that is put to them and the case that we can discuss with governments and with the EU is as strong and as clear as possible, that this species needs the strictest protection available if we are to see mako given any chance of recovery in the North Atlantic and also in the South, because the lessons from the North apply to the population in the South. That population is not quite as challenged at this time, but it can go that way. Sharks suffer from this, from boom bust, the impacts of boom bust fisheries, and mako is one that has been overlooked for decades, and now these industries must take really strong steps to ensure this population has an opportunity to recover. And I hope then you would see, Tommy, more short-fin mako in UK waters. So there is a reason why you're seeing less and hearing less. I mean, I have heard of the odd mako caught by anglers in recent years.
Really?
But
really?
Yeah. Out there on the high seas, though, it is essential. And this twins with studies that are going on. Looking at what's being caught by anglers, looking at post-release survival and things like that. It's really essential that we understand that, but it's also essential that we curb this pressure. So whereas I said the commercial fisheries for porbeagle have been prohibited, that is not the same with the mako, and we're working very hard through our No Limits campaign to deliver effective management for mako.
That's the most frustrating thing, that when you have a critically endangered species, which population collapses and they're still exploited commercially.
Well,
you would think, how it's possible.
To be clear, mako they're endangered. They haven't quite reached that critically endangered status, but that is not a positive situation to see them in. They're also a species that's been proposed for listing on the CITES, on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and the Conference of Parties for CITES is later this year. And so there is a move to encourage trade restrictions for mako. And to implement those trade restrictions effectively, we would need to see fisheries management adopted, effective catch limits. So there is a thread that goes through a lot of what I tend to talk about. To me, that's effective fisheries management, the implementation of catch limits. So ensuring what's out there and what's being caught is caught in a sustainable fashion. And whether that's by commercial industry or it's by the recreational community, all of this needs to work towards the greatest level of sustainability. And just to make sure that we have these species going forwards and those populations are in the best state they can be.
Exactly. Ali, listen, it's been fantastic. And I wish you and the whole crew at Shark Trust and all your partners everything best in your work. You're doing
Thank you.
fantastic job and fantastic work for benefit of us all, really, and for the health of the ocean, because we know how important sharks are for the health of the ocean. So that's absolutely fantastic job. Tell us how people can get involved and how they can support Shark Trust and that fabulous job that you're doing.
Well, thank you. We are a membership organisation, so you can join us and support us through your memberships and through donations and fundraising. Everything we do, we have to raise the funds to achieve. And one of the most important things is being able to turn up and speak up at these fisheries meetings. The commercial industry will be there, and if there is no counterpoint to the commercial industry, then we can't move forwards with conservation for these species. So that's really important, to become a member, to support the work we do, to understand that we are very efficient with the use of our funds as an organisation. To join us in our citizen science work, become a citizen scientist, engage in the Great Egg Case Hunt, record your catches as an angler, engage in discussion on social media. So I think really it's about getting involved at whatever level is the right one for you, whether it's becoming a member of the trust, receiving our magazine, engaging that way, or just getting out on the beaches and becoming a citizen scientist and increasing your passion and knowledge for these fantastic species. There's lots of ways you can get involved, and if you're short of ideas, drop us a line and we'll help you along.
That's great. Ali, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tommy. Great to speak to you.